All right, so imagine you just graduated high school and you throw a huge graduation party. And you invite all your friends, all your family, and you show up and you guys are having fun. And all of a sudden, some weird guy you've never seen before just walks up to you and says, "Hey, I'm proud of you," and hands you this envelope. And you don't know what to do, right? But you don't want to be rude. So what you do is you grab the envelope, you say, "Thanks," and you go, you stuff it in your back pocket, and you look up, and by the time you look up, person is gone. So you continue with the night, hanging out with your friends, try to just ignore what just happened, right? And as the night goes on, you have fun, you send everyone home, right? You start putting your presents away, and then you remember the envelope, and you pull it out of your pocket, and when you open it, you find out that it is a check of $5 million. All right, so my question is, what would you do with that money? What's the three things that you would do? I want you to use the chat that's connected to this video right here on YouTube, and just throw out there, what are the three things you do? And we're gonna give you 30 seconds to do this. Philip Yancey is a man who wrote a book called What's So Amazing About Grace. And in the book, he talks about this pretty amazing story, a story I had never heard of until I started to prepare for this message. He tells about two people who were getting ready to get married, and they decided to get married at this hotel in Boston. I think it's called the Hyatt Hotel. And so they had to pay, obviously, to get married there, and they end up paying $13,000 to rent out this hotel for that night. Well, what ends up happening is, unfortunately, the groom decides that he has changed his mind, and after a couple days, calls off the wedding. So now this bride has to go about and cancel out this wedding. Unfortunate, right? And so she goes to talk to the hotel people, and what she finds out is that in order to cancel out the wedding, the only thing she would receive back, if she decides to do so, is 10% of what they paid to have the wedding at this hotel. Sucks. And so she decides, you know what, I'm going to think on it. And she takes a couple days to herself, starts thinking about it. Now, as she's thinking, she takes the time to remember her past. Now, 10 years ago, this woman actually lived in a homeless shelter. And out of the grace of God, she was actually able to move up and get a good job and save money and get back on her feet. And so as she's thinking about what she should do, whether she should take the 10% of what she paid to have this hotel, she remembers what she struggled with, in her past years. And what she decides to do is throw a big party. And that's what she does. She throws this huge party, and she sends out invitations to all the homeless people in that area in Boston. And so they all come out, and she throws a huge party for all these people, and they have a night that they will never forget. And they're basically treated as kings and queens for that night. And it is just awesome. What is it about stories like this, where somebody receives something they could have never received on their own? Or stories where somebody gets something out of the blue and they're blessed in a way that they just don't expect, in this huge, amazing way. What is it about these stories that they grab hold of us, right? They stop us in our tracks, and they put us in awe, right? See, part of the reason why we are grabbed by stories like this, I believe, is because we live in a grace-deprived world. These stories are unlike anything we see or experience on a day-to-day basis. We rarely ever really hear about people acting in such ways that blow us away like this. You see, if you're anything like me, you long to see people in places of power or places of influence who are willing to stretch out their hands to people who are in places where they need help, or they could use an act of kindness. See, the cool thing is that today we actually get to experience and talk about a story that is a lot like those stories. We get to see King David, a man who was promised by God to be the king, the future king of Israel, right? And God promised David this. And it didn't make sense at the time because Saul was actually the king at the time. And so David was in a position where it was almost virtually impossible for him to be king. And yet he believed and trusted God that he would become king one day. And now he is finally king. He has finally received a position that he was promised years ago. And so as we discussed last week, the first thing David decides to do is he looks around and sees that God's Ark of the Covenant does not have a place to be. It does not have a place to be glorified. And so he goes to God and says, God, let me glorify you. Let me build you a temple. And God is just baffled by this decision of David to try and build this temple for God. He's just blown away that God has blessed him so much, and yet David wants to bless God back for what he's been given. And so what God decides to do is say, you know what? I'm going to bring someone out of you, out of your kids in the future will come someone who will bring a kingdom unlike anything you've ever seen, who will bring a kingdom that will reign forever. And as we discussed last week, God was referring to, not only was he going to use David's future son, Solomon, but what God was really looking at, what God was really foreshadowing or discussing, talking to David about, was the kingdom that we now experience here today, the kingdom that was brought to us by Jesus Christ. And so the cool thing is that God continues to bless David. And in chapter 8, what we see is that God continues to bring victory after victory over David. And so David's kingdom continues to grow and grow, and he continues to gain more land and win wars, and he's just blessed in so many different ways. And so today's lesson is going to be based on chapter 9. And today we're going to get to see what David does once he's blessed at the height of his kingdom. He's blessed so much by God, what he decides to do with these blessings. Let's go ahead and take a look together. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there still not someone of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him?" Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his feet and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I am your servant." And David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant, that you should show your regard for a dead dog such as I?" Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul, and to all his house, I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table, like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. So David has everything he could ever imagine, everything he could ever want, right? God has finally blessed him with what he had originally promised David he would have, and more, continues to give him victories on end. Like it continues to go on. And yet for some reason, there is this growing desire in David to want to bless someone with what God has blessed him with. How incredible is that? And so David decides to look out and calls for one of his servants and says, "Hey, can you check for me and see if there's someone from Saul or Jonathan's family still alive? I would love to bless one of them." And so they go out and they find a servant called Ziba. And the servant of Saul's family shows up and says, "Yes, there is still a son of Jonathan who is still alive. And this guy's name is Mephibosheth." Now, Mephibosheth is as we read, he is crippled. He is being taken care of by Ziba, and he's crippled. And as we know, unfortunately, back in those days, handicapped people were not treated well. And so Mephibosheth did not have high views of himself. And we know that. We can see that. The way he describes himself as a dog, and says, not just that he's a dog, but says, man, I'm a dead dog. I don't belong here. When he comes to speak to David, he says, dude, I don't know why you're even talking to me right now. I am the last person who should be anywhere near you. That's his view of himself. And unfortunately, sometimes we have that view of ourselves. But David refuses to look at Jonathan's son this way. He doesn't even address what Jonathan's son says about him. He completely turns his face and says, you know what? We're going to bless him. We're going to bless him so much. I want him to have everything that his dad once had, that all the land that Saul had, we are going to give back to Mephibosheth, right? And he says, and on top of that, we're going to bless him even more. I desire that he is to stay at my table. He is to eat at my table for all the days of his life. Every day of his life, he is going to be honored, and he is able to eat with me and the rest of my sons, the rest of my family. Now, why is this a big deal? Because the table of the king, right? To be able to eat at the table of the king, that means you had to have a place in royalty. And so he's looking at Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, which was part of Jonathan was Saul's son, which means that this is the past royalty's family, okay? Usually you would look at this family and you would do everything you can to get rid of this family, because there is always a chance that for some reason this family could turn on you and try and take over your kingdom. But David trusted God. And he had such a profound love for his people and such a profound love for God that all he wanted to do was to do good. And so he looks over and says, Mephibosheth, man, I'm going to bless you and you're going to be considered as royalty. He places him in such a high position that in a sense, Mephibosheth is being treated as if he's one of David's sons. That's insane. So why is this so crazy? Why is this so mind-boggling? Why does it stop you in your tracks? Guys, because this same story, this same example of grace is exactly what has been done to us. What Jesus did allows us now to be looked upon as sons and daughters of God. Now we receive everything that Jesus received. When God looks at us, he sees Jesus. And that is amazing. That should stop you in your tracks. That should make you lift your head up high. Because that means if you are a daughter, you are a princess. If you are a son, you are a prince. That should change the way you talk, the way you talk about those around you, the way you think, the way you walk, the way you dress. It should make you someone new. It should remind you of the price that Jesus paid on the cross, and should lift you up daily. Because of what Jesus did on the cross, we are now adopted into this royal family of God. And that changes everything. Don't you see? And so tonight we're going to discuss this a little bit more. We're going to discuss more about acts of kindness, of how we should be treating those around us, and what we can do with what God has given us. And also we will be discussing what it means to be a prince and a princess in the family of Jesus. And so let's go ahead and take this time to dive into this together.